In the winter of 1879, when authorities opened the graves behind St. Stephen's Church in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, they uncovered a chilling discovery of the 157 coffins buried over 12 years. None contained human remains. Instead, each coffin held stones carefully arranged to mimic the deceased, all while church records showed insurance payouts totaling over $300,000, a staggering amount for that time. What happened to these 157 individuals who were believed to have died peacefully in their beds? The truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined, revealing a web of deception that stretched from the church pulpit to Pennsylvania's darkest corners. Tonight, we'll uncover the full story of Reverend Marcus Thompson and the conspiracy that turned a church into a marketplace for human lives. But before we dive into the details, let me ask you, this channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront America's darkest histories. Help me with a like and a subscribe to motivate me to make better videos, and don't forget to comment which country you are from. If you're ready to hear stories others dare not tell, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Also, let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. Now let's uncover the truth about St. Stephen's Church and what really happened in the Pennsylvania coalfields over a century ago. The story of St. Stephen's Church begins in 1867 in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a town built on coal dust and dreams shattered by hard labor. Home to nearly 3,000 Welsh and Irish immigrants, Millbrook was a town forged by the mines, where cave-ins, explosions, and the Black Lung claimed many lives. St. Stephen's Episcopal Church, modest and unadorned, served the Protestant community, many of whom lacked the strong networks of support that their Catholic neighbors had. This vulnerability would become central to the unfolding tragedy. Reverend Marcus Thompson arrived in 1867, a tall man of 45, with a comforting voice and impeccable credentials. His wife Catherine also became active in the church, organizing social events and visiting the sick. His arrival was perfectly timed, as the town had just lost its previous rector, Reverend William Hayes, during one of the deadliest periods in the mine's history. In his first 6 months, Thompson conducted 14 funerals, surpassing Hayes's 2-year record. But Thompson brought more than just spiritual support. He introduced a revolutionary life insurance program. From the pulpit, he announced his mission to ease the suffering of widows and orphans left by the mines. Church members could purchase life insurance policies through Thompson's partnership with Keystone Mutual Assurance, offering affordable premiums and immediate payouts to widows. Within 6 months, over 200 families had enrolled. Thompson's personal attention to the grieving families made his program more attractive than any other insurance available. But as the story would reveal, this seemingly benevolent program was the beginning of a dark conspiracy. Payments for the insurance claims often took months to process, but Thompson personally guaranteed that families would receive their benefits within days of burial. He handled all the paperwork, coordinated with the insurance company, and even advanced funds from the church to ensure no family was left waiting. Dr. Cornelius Whitman, a young and ambitious doctor who had recently settled in Millbrook, became an essential part of this arrangement. He worked closely with Thompson, often waiving his fees for examining the deceased and providing death certificates. This Christian charity was another blessing Thompson claimed to have brought to the community. Samuel Crow, the local undertaker and sexton of St. Stephen's Cemetery, completed the trio of support for grieving families. Crow had served Millbrook for 15 years, offering fair prices, payment plans, and utmost discretion. This system of care, spiritual, medical, and practical, made St. Stephen's Church a beacon of hope in a town where death was a constant companion. Families felt assured that their loved ones would be treated with respect in death, and survivors would be taken care of. However, the first sign that something was terribly wrong came in February 1868. Thomas McKenna, a miner, spotted a familiar figure limping along the railroad tracks, a man he recognized as James Morrison, a fellow miner and church member. The problem was McKenna had attended Morrison's funeral just 3 weeks earlier. McKenna called out, but the man didn't respond. By the time McKenna reached the spot where he had seen him, the figure had vanished. The early morning mist made visibility poor, and McKenna convinced himself it was a mistake. Perhaps grief or guilt had played tricks on his mind. Morrison had died in a mine accident crushed by a falling beam, and McKenna had blamed himself for not warning his friend in time. So he said nothing, unsure how to explain seeing a dead man walking. McKenna wasn't the only one experiencing strange encounters. Over the next few months, other residents reported similar sightings. Mario Sullivan swore she saw her deceased husband buying supplies at a general store in a nearby town. Agnes Fletcher claimed to have seen her late son Benjamin at her kitchen window, thinner but unmistakably alive. Each sighting was dismissed by the witnesses themselves, figments of imagination, tricks of light, or cases of mistaken identity. The sightings shared disturbing similarities. The ghosts were always seen from a distance, always in neighboring towns, always thinner and more gaunt than remembered, and they never responded or approached anyone. When pursued, they vanished. Reverend Thompson, when consulted about these strange visions, offered comfort with a theological explanation. Grief manifests in mysterious ways, he said from the pulpit. The mind, in its desperate need to hold on to what is lost, sometimes creates what the heart most desires to see. These are not supernatural visitations, but rather the natural response of souls struggling to accept God's will. His explanations were compassionate but completely wrong. The truth was far more systematic and far more cruel. James Morrison had died on January 15, 1868, and the story of what really happened to him was only beginning to unravel. In 1868, James Morrison, a 34-year-old miner, was diagnosed with black lung disease, a common fate for men working in the mines. His condition was terminal, and Dr. Whitman informed him that he had only weeks or months to live. Struggling to support his wife and 3 young children, Morrison's insurance policy through Thompson's program would barely cover his medical costs. Desperate, Morrison was offered an alternative by Dr. Whitman. He could be declared dead of acute heart failure, a plausible cause for a miner's death. His body would be prepared by the undertaker Samuel Crow and his funeral conducted by Thompson, ensuring the family would receive the insurance payout quickly. Meanwhile, Morrison would be sent to work in the deep mines of western Pennsylvania under a false identity, continuing until his disease claimed him. Whitman, detached and clinical, framed it as a Christian solution. Morrison's death would benefit his family and serve the industrial progress of the state. What Morrison didn't know was that he wasn't heading to work. He was becoming part of a vast human trafficking scheme. The conspiracy was shocking in its scope. Thompson provided the framework, managing the insurance details and creating trust within the community. Whitman supplied false death certificates. Crow handled the burials, and a network of labor contractors transported the deceased to remote mines where they worked under assumed names. They were effectively slaves working in dangerous conditions until they died. Their families would never see them again, and the money Thompson and his associates received from the labor contractors was a flat fee for each able-bodied worker delivered. This began what became known as the Millbrook Method, a systematic process of turning tragedy into profit. The operation grew over the years, preying on those already facing financial or medical crises. Thompson's genius lay in targeting vulnerable families, those dealing with illness, injury, or debt, and offering them immediate financial relief through early insurance payouts in exchange for temporary sacrifices. Dr. Whitman's role expanded as he identified potential victims through his medical practice, offering preventive care that served as a screening process for suitable candidates. He used health examinations not only to assess conditions, but to gather intelligence on financial situations, looking for men with large families and limited social support who were the most vulnerable. Meanwhile, Samuel Crowe perfected the art of creating convincing corpses. Using sawdust rags and stones, he made bodies that appeared lifelike, ensuring they passed the necessary inspections. Once the body was viewed, the coffin was sealed immediately, often with an explanation of rapid decomposition or infectious disease. These techniques made extended wakes unnecessary, and the funerals appeared legitimate. Thompson's sermons were crafted to prevent close scrutiny of his operations. They were emotionally overwhelming, designed to leave families drained, grateful, and trusting, not suspicious. He focused on themes of sacrifice, redemption, and the mysterious ways of divine providence, pulling the congregation into a state of emotional intensity. These services became a ritual of comfort and false hope, ensuring that no one questioned what was happening. Between 1868 and 1870, 12 more men fell victim to the system Thompson had perfected. Each case followed the same pattern: terminal diagnosis or debilitating injury, a consultation with Dr. Whitman, a private meeting with Reverend Thompson, a staged death, an elaborate funeral, immediate insurance payout, and then transportation to remote mining operations. The victims were typically men in their 30s and 40s, old enough to have families to support, yet young enough to provide years of labor. They came from different backgrounds within the Protestant community: Welsh miners, German railroad workers, Irish farmers turned miners after crop failures. What they all shared was desperation and the belief that they were making a noble sacrifice for their families. They never realized they were being sold into slavery. The mining operations that purchased these men were located in the remote corners of western Pennsylvania, where the demand for expendable labor was high and regulations were virtually non-existent. These weren't the well-established companies with safety protocols. These were illegal or semi-legal operations, extracting coal from unstable, dangerous deposits using outdated methods that legitimate companies had long abandoned. Workers faced grueling 12 to 16-hour shifts in poorly ventilated tunnels using malfunctioning equipment. They lived in overcrowded barracks, receiving inadequate food and medical care. The death rates were astronomical, but the operators didn't care. There was always a new supply of workers available, courtesy of Thompson. The men who survived more than a few months in these hellish conditions became mere shells of their former selves. The combination of extreme labor, poor nutrition, constant danger, and isolation from their families broke their spirits and bodies. Even if they managed to escape, they faced the impossible task of explaining their return from the dead to families who had mourned them and collected the insurance payouts based on their deaths. This psychological trap was one of the cruelest aspects of the entire system. These men became complicit in their own enslavement, unable to reveal the truth without destroying the very families they had tried to protect. By 1870, Thompson's operation had generated over $6,500 in insurance payouts, a fortune at the time. More importantly, he had become one of the most trusted and beloved figures in Millbrook. His church membership had grown dramatically, drawn by his practical approach to family security and his apparent genuine concern for his congregation's welfare. The Keystone Mutual Assurance Company, far from being suspicious of the high death rate among St. Stephen's policyholders, was pleased with the arrangement. Thompson's prompt submission of documentation and lack of disputed claims made Millbrook one of their most profitable markets. The company even began recommending Thompson's methods as an example of effective customer service. But Thompson's success would ultimately lead to the system's expansion and its exposure. The operation had become too profitable to remain small, too successful to avoid attracting attention, and too dependent on human misery to continue without consequences. The shadows of the past were about to give way to an even darker chapter. As Thompson prepared to scale his operation, what began as an opportunistic arrangement with a single dying miner would soon encompass entire families. The Methodist approach of individual salvation would evolve into something that resembled wholesale slaughter. The turning point came in the spring of 1871 when an unexpected visitor arrived in Millbrook. Colonel Harrison Blackwood. Stepping off the Pennsylvania Railroad on a Thursday morning, Blackwood's expensive suit and leather satchels suggested that he meant business. A veteran of the Civil War, Blackwood had transitioned into industrial ventures, specifically operating mining concerns in the most remote and dangerous locations across Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. What Blackwood offered Thompson was a dramatically expanded market for his services. Reverend Thompson Blackwood began during their private meeting in the church office. "I represent a consortium of mining operations that have been impressed by your innovative approach to labor acquisition. We have an immediate need for 500 able-bodied workers, and we're prepared to pay premium rates for rapid delivery." At $75 per worker, Blackwood's offer was triple the amount Thompson had previously received. This single contract would generate $37,500 more than most ministers earned in a lifetime. But Blackwood's proposal went far beyond just expanding Thompson's current methods. "We're not just interested in the dying and desperate," Blackwood explained. "We need healthy workers who can contribute for years, not just months. We're prepared to offer family packages, situations where entire households can benefit from relocation with generous compensation for wives and children." Thompson understood immediately what this meant. The scale of what Blackwood was offering would turn his operation from a regional scam into a vast, systematic enterprise, one that would turn entire families into commodities for the mining industry. It was an opportunity for expansion beyond his wildest dreams, but it also marked the moment when Thompson's operation would evolve into something far more sinister and ultimately unstoppable. Blackwood's proposition was a significant expansion of Thompson's operations. Instead of only targeting terminally ill men, they would now recruit healthy workers under false pretenses. These workers would be promised profitable employment in far-off locations, only to be delivered into slavery. The families would receive insurance payouts for accidental deaths that had never occurred, while the workers themselves disappeared into the brutal and illegal mining operations. Dr. Whitman was initially reluctant. Falsifying death certificates for men who were already sick or dying felt justifiable in some twisted way. Those men were likely to die soon anyway, and their families did benefit from early insurance payments. But targeting healthy men, tricking them into believing they were getting a legitimate job opportunity, crossed a line that made Whitman deeply uncomfortable. During one of their private consultations, Whitman expressed his concerns. "What we've been doing serves a purpose. We've helped families in desperate situations, provided for widows and orphans who would otherwise face destitution," he said. "But this is something else entirely." Thompson's response revealed just how far he had fallen from his original sense of moral duty. "Cornelius, you're thinking too narrowly," he said, his voice heavy with the pastoral authority he used in his sermons. "These men will work productively for years, contributing to the industrial strength of our nation while providing security for their families. Instead of wasting away in these played-out mines, watching their lungs slowly fill with coal dust, they'll be building America's future in new territories. It's not cruelty, it's opportunity." Thompson had become expert at reframing slavery as salvation, presenting the utter destruction of families as family protection. His ability to justify the unjustifiable through religious rhetoric had become disturbingly refined, teetering on the edge of self-delusion or something even darker. Samuel Crow, the undertaker, required no convincing. He had already profited immensely from the scheme and had developed a taste for it. He began suggesting ways to improve the process, making it more efficient and less likely to attract attention. "We need to vary our approach," Crow recommended. "Too many deaths from the same causes might eventually raise questions. I can arrange mining accidents, house fires, even drownings. Each method requires different preparation, but the results are equally effective. The first family processed under the expanded system was the Henderson family. Robert the father was a skilled carpenter who had been struggling to find steady work as mine construction slowed. When Thompson approached him with an offer of lucrative employment, building mining infrastructure in Colorado, it seemed like an answer to prayer. The arrangement seemed generous. Robert would travel ahead to establish housing and employment, while his wife Sarah and their sons would follow months later. Thompson even arranged for Robert to purchase a substantial life insurance policy, which could later be converted to family coverage once they were settled in Colorado. What actually happened was that Robert was declared dead in a mining accident just 2 weeks after his supposed departure. Sarah received a $1,000 insurance payout and a detailed report of his tragic death in a tunnel collapse. She was told that his body had been too damaged to return to Pennsylvania, but that he had received a proper Christian burial in Colorado. 3 months later, Sarah and her sons were approached again by Thompson, who explained that Robert had made arrangements before his death for the family to join him in Colorado, where they could continue working with associates who would honor his wishes. The insurance money would cover their travel expenses, and profitable employment awaited them. Grieving and trusting the minister who had provided so much comfort, Sarah agreed. She and her sons were given train tickets to what they believed was Colorado, but they were actually transported to a remote mining camp in West Virginia. There, they were thrust into conditions that resembled nothing so much as a prison. The Hendersons had been processed into slavery, and their disappearance marked the beginning of what became known as family processing. This method was even more efficient than the previous system. By 1875, Thompson had processed 43 complete families, generating over $85,000 in insurance payouts and delivering nearly 200 workers to Blackwood's consortium. But the risks were greater. Unlike the original victims, these families were healthy and connected to the community, and they were likely to be missed. Thompson needed a solution to explain their disappearances and avoid investigation. His answer was both brilliant and horrifying in its simplicity. He began spreading stories of religious revival movements in the Western Territories, communities of devout Christians establishing new settlements based on biblical principles. Families who joined these movements, Thompson explained, severed all ties with their previous communities in their dedication to their new spiritual calling. "The Lord is calling his people to new lands," Thompson would proclaim from the pulpit, just as he called Abraham from Moses from Egypt and the disciples from their nets. "Some among us have heard this calling and chosen to answer, to sacrifice the comfort of familiar surroundings for the greater glory of establishing God's kingdom in the wilderness." This religious framework provided perfect cover for the family's disappearances. When the Hendersons and others vanished, the community assumed they had joined religious settlements and chosen to cut contact with their previous lives. It was unusual but not unprecedented. Religious enthusiasm had often led to dramatic lifestyle changes, and the idea of Christian communities in the frontier didn't seem far-fetched. Thus, Thompson managed to explain the disappearance of entire families, maintaining the illusion of a righteous cause while continuing to profit from their suffering. Thompson had created an elaborate system to cover up his horrific operations, even arranging for occasional letters to be sent to Millbrook from families supposedly thriving in the Western Territories. These letters, written by Thompson's associates, described successful farming ventures, religious communities, and deep satisfaction with their new lives, reinforcing the illusion while discouraging any further investigation. By 1875, Thompson's operation had evolved into something unprecedented in American criminal history. It was a systematic program of family destruction disguised as religious ministry, operating with full trust and support from the victimized community. The conspiracy had processed over 120 people, generated more than $150,000 in fraudulent insurance payments, and created a network of forced labor camps stretching across 3 states. However, the sheer scale of success was starting to attract unwanted attention. The high death and disappearance rate among St. Stephen's congregation began to raise suspicions from church authorities, insurance investigators, and law enforcement agencies. More critically, some of the original victims had survived long enough in the labor camps to plan escapes. Their knowledge of Thompson's methods made them extremely dangerous to the operation. The shadows of the past were about to collide with the present, and this collision would expose secrets buried deeper than any of the empty coffins in St. Stephen's Cemetery. Just when it seemed the full extent of Reverend Thompson's operation had been uncovered, a new and unexpected turn of events began to unravel the conspiracy. The last person anyone would have suspected to start the investigation was Rebecca Morrison, the widow of James Morrison, the first victim of Thompson's scam 7 years earlier. Rebecca had been one of Thompson's greatest success stories. After receiving her husband's insurance money in 1868, she used it to open a boarding house that catered to traveling salesmen and mining supervisors. The business flourished, and she became one of Millbrook's most respected widows, seen as living proof of the financial security Thompson's program had provided to grieving families. However, Rebecca was also one of the few residents of Millbrook who read newspapers from other cities. In October of 1875, while reviewing a Philadelphia paper left by one of her boarders, Rebecca noticed a small article about labor conditions in the anthracite mines near Centria. The article mentioned a mine accident that had killed 15 workers, including several whose background suggested they weren't typical miners. What caught her attention was the mention of James Morrison, listed as a casualty aged 38, and originally from the Schuylkill region. The age was wrong. Her James would have been 41 by 1875, but the name and regional origin created an impossible coincidence. How could there be another James Morrison from the same area working in the same industry who had died in a mine accident? Rebecca began collecting newspapers from other cities, searching for any mention of mining accidents, labor disputes, or unusual deaths. What she discovered over the next few months revealed a chilling pattern. Names began appearing exact matches, not just variations or coincidences. Thomas McKenna, who had supposedly died of black lung disease in 1869, Patrick O'Sullivan, officially deceased from a mining accident in 1870, Benjamin Fletcher, a heart attack victim in 1871. The newspaper accounts described them as active workers who had died in industrial accidents between 1872 and 1875, years after their official deaths and elaborate funerals in Millbrook. Rebecca faced an impossible situation. Either there were multiple men in Pennsylvania sharing identical names with recently deceased members of her community, or the men she had mourned were still alive, or at least had been alive for years after their supposed deaths. Her first instinct was to approach Reverend Thompson, seeking his guidance and comfort in understanding what seemed like impossible coincidences. But something made her hesitate. She remembered Thompson's quick, almost too smooth explanations for strange occurrences in the past, and how he had discouraged discussion when other community members reported seeing their deceased relatives in neighboring towns. Instead, Rebecca decided to conduct her own investigation, using her boarding house as a base of operations. She began corresponding with newspapers, coroners, and mining authorities in the regions where deceased Millbrook residents had supposedly died in industrial accidents. Her questions were carefully framed as those of a grieving community member seeking to understand the tragic pattern of accidents affecting men from her area. The responses she received painted a picture that defied every assumption about death, burial, and community trust. According to mining records, James Morrison had been employed by the Centria Deep Coal Company from March 1868 until his death in October 1875, a period that began just 2 months after his funeral in Millbrook. Employment records showed him as a skilled miner, brought in as part of a group recruited from eastern Pennsylvania. He had lived in company housing, received company pay, and had been buried in the company cemetery after his death in a tunnel collapse. The same pattern emerged for other names. Men who had been mourned and buried in Millbrook had actually been working in remote mining operations for years after their supposed deaths. They had been employed under their real names, suggesting they weren't hiding their identities, but living and working as active miners in other locations. This revelation forced Rebecca to a terrible conclusion. Either the entire concept of death had become unreliable, or the men buried in St. Stephen's Cemetery hadn't been buried there at all. With this new damning evidence, Rebecca decided to investigate further. On a cold November night in 1875, she recruited her brother-in-law Daniel Walsh and two trusted neighbors to help her investigate one of the graves. They chose James Morrison's grave partly because Rebecca felt she had the right to know the truth about her husband, and also because his burial site was relatively isolated in the newer section of the cemetery. The four conspirators worked by lamplight, taking turns with shovels, expecting to find either human remains or evidence of desecration. What they found was devastating: a coffin full of stones and sawdust, carefully arranged to approximate the weight and dimensions of a human body. The discovery was shocking and devastating, and it revealed the full scope of Thompson's deception. But it also created a new problem for Rebecca and her associates. They now possessed evidence of a crime, but they had obtained it through illegal means. Disturbing a grave was a serious offense, and their actions could result in prosecution. Moreover, they had no way of knowing how extensive the conspiracy was or who else might be involved. If Reverend Thompson was part of the deception, who else might be complicit? Dr. Whitman had signed the death certificates. Samuel Crowe had prepared the bodies and had conducted the burials. Who else had played a role in this monstrous scheme? ChatGPT said Rebecca Morrison's investigation into the dark workings of Thompson's conspiracy had uncovered a chilling pattern. As she and her associates secretly examined 6 more graves, they found the same evidence: coffins filled with stones designed to mimic human bodies but containing no human remains. Meanwhile, Thompson began to sense new risks threatening his operation. The expansion into family processing had introduced logistical challenges and more individuals who possessed dangerous knowledge. Some of the families processed through his system had extended relatives in other communities, prompting uncomfortable questions about their sudden disappearance and subsequent silence. More troubling were reports from Blackwood's consortium about issues in the labor camps. Some original victims had survived longer than expected and were organizing resistance, even managing to escape. These escaped workers who knew Thompson's methods and the false deaths that enabled their enslavement posed a major threat to the entire operation. Thompson began making preparations for what he privately referred to as operational conclusion, a systematic elimination of evidence and witnesses that would allow him to relocate and establish similar operations in other communities. His preparations included plans for dealing with potentially problematic community members who might have uncovered too much. Unfortunately, Rebecca had no idea that her investigation had drawn Thompson's attention, or that her name had been added to a list of those who posed unacceptable risks to the conspiracy. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether the truth about St. Stephen's Church would be exposed or buried forever along with its witnesses. Rebecca held the evidence that could destroy Thompson's operation, but Thompson held power over an entire community and resources capable of eliminating a troublesome widow. The question wasn't whether they would clash, it was whether anyone would survive the confrontation. It all began on a gray December morning in 1875 when Rebecca made the mistake of trusting the wrong person with her discoveries. She decided to approach Dr. Cornelius Whitman first, believing his medical training and professional ethics would make him a reliable ally in exposing the conspiracy. Rebecca reasoned that if Whitman had been deceived into signing false death certificates, he would want to correct the record and prevent further crimes. If he was complicit, her approach would force him to reveal himself. She was catastrophically wrong on both accounts. When Rebecca presented her findings to Dr. Whitman in his office, showing him the photographs of the opened graves and the documentation about deceased miners working in other locations, his reaction was immediate and chilling. "Mrs. Morrison," he said quietly, "you've made a very serious mistake coming here." Within hours, Rebecca found herself confronting not just Dr. Whitman's betrayal, but the full extent of the conspiracy she had been unknowingly caught in for the past 7 years. Reverend Thompson arrived at Whitman's office accompanied by Samuel Crow and 2 men Rebecca didn't recognize, rough-looking individuals who clearly weren't from Millbrook. Rebecca Thompson said, his pastoral voice carrying none of its usual warmth. "You've discovered something that puts not just you, but your entire community at risk. The work we've been doing here serves a greater purpose than you understand. The men you think we've wronged have contributed to industrial progress that benefits the entire nation. The families who received insurance payments have been saved from destitution. What seems like deception to you is actually a form of divine providence working through human agency." Thompson's attempt to justify the conspiracy with religious rhetoric revealed the complete moral corruption that had transformed him from a minister into a monster. But Rebecca Morrison was no longer the grieving widow who had accepted his comfort 7 years earlier. She had become something far more dangerous to the conspiracy, a determined adversary. "You're not serving God," Rebecca replied, her voice steady despite her fear. "You're serving yourself. You've turned our church into a slaughterhouse, our community into a hunting ground, and our faith into a marketplace for human souls. James is dead now, really dead, and so are all the others. They died as slaves in your minds, far from their families, believing they had sacrificed themselves for a noble purpose. You've committed murder, Reverend Thompson, mass murder disguised as ministry." The accusation hit its target with devastating accuracy. Thompson's carefully constructed theological justifications crumbled under the weight of simple truth. For a moment, the mask of pastoral concern slipped, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "What you call murder, Mrs. Morrison has provided security for dozens of families and productive labor for expanding industries. These men would have died anyway in our played-out mines from our black lung disease from industrial accidents. We simply redirected their deaths to serve a useful purpose." Dr. Whitman stepped forward, his medical bag in hand. "Rebecca, you're clearly distraught. The evidence you think you've found can be explained through rational means. Grave robbing is a serious crime, and the stress of conducting such activities has obviously affected your mental state. I'm going to give you something to help you rest, and then we can discuss how to address this situation properly." Rebecca had anticipated this possibility. Before coming to Whitman's office, she had left detailed documentation with trusted individuals outside the community, letters, photographs, and records that would expose the conspiracy even if something happened to her. She had done everything she could to ensure that Thompson's criminal empire would be brought to light even if she didn't survive the confrontation. Now she knew that her survival and the truth depended on how far she was willing to push back against the conspiracy that had already taken so much. Rebecca had prepared herself for the worst. She had instructed her brother-in-law Daniel Walsh to contact authorities in Philadelphia if she didn't return by evening. Copies of her findings, including the evidence of the conspiracy, had already been sent to the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Pennsylvania State Police. Though she hadn't mentioned this precaution to anyone in Millbrook, Rebecca had taken every step to ensure that if anything happened to her, the truth would eventually come to light. When she confronted Dr. Whitman in his office with the incriminating evidence, she knew that she was walking a dangerous line. "Dr. Whitman," she said, backing toward the door, If you approach me with that bag, you'll be committing assault in front of witnesses. And gentlemen, if anything happens to me today, detailed evidence of your conspiracy will be in the hands of state authorities by tomorrow morning." Her precaution completely shifted the dynamic. Thompson and his associates now faced a choice. They could act immediately, eliminating Rebecca as a threat, but that would surely expose their operation, or they could let her leave, knowing that her knowledge could one day bring everything crashing down. Thompson, with the careful calculation of someone who had spent years building his empire, chose a middle path. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, his tone still calm, "you're acting on incomplete information. Yes, we have been creative in our methods of helping families in crisis, but you don't understand the full scope of what we've accomplished. Would you be willing to see the complete picture before making final judgments? Would you visit one of our operations, speak with the men you think are victims? See for yourself how they live and work?" It was a trap, of course. Thompson was offering Rebecca the chance to visit one of Blackwood's mining operations, where in all likelihood she would suffer a fatal accident, removing her as a threat while providing a plausible explanation for her death. But Rebecca had spent months studying Thompson's methods, and she recognized the offer for what it was. "I'll consider your offer," she replied carefully, "but only if you agree to my conditions. I want to visit these operations accompanied by independent witnesses, perhaps representatives from the state mining authority or the Philadelphia newspapers. I want advanced notice of exactly where we're going and when, and I want guarantees about communication with outside authorities during the visit." These conditions made Thompson's trap impossible to execute. It also revealed to him that Rebecca understood exactly what he had been proposing, and the pretense of peaceful resolution evaporated. Now the stark reality of the situation was clear. Samuel Crow, the undertaker, who had long been a key player in the conspiracy, spoke up for the first time during the confrontation. His voice carried the flat affect of someone who had dealt with death for far too long. "She knows too much, and she's prepared too well. This ends one of two ways: she disappears tonight, or we all hang next month." His blunt assessment forced everyone in the room to confront the full implications of the situation. Thompson's conspiracy had grown too large to contain, and Rebecca had made preparations that would make it impossible to silence her without confirming the very accusations she had made. But Thompson had spent 7 years building his operation, generating enormous profits, convincing himself that his crimes served a higher purpose. He wasn't prepared to give it all up because one woman had discovered the truth. "Mrs. Morrison," Thompson said, his voice quiet but tinged with desperation, "I want you to understand something. The men in this room have committed themselves completely to our mission. We've moved beyond the point where retreat is possible. If our work is exposed, dozens of families will lose the insurance payments that have sustained them for years. Hundreds of workers will be abandoned in mining operations where they have no legal status or protection. The economic disruption alone will destroy this community." It was a desperate attempt at moral blackmail, an appeal to Rebecca's empathy and sense of duty. Thompson was suggesting that exposing the conspiracy would harm the very people it had victimized. But Rebecca, unwavering, was prepared for this argument. "Reverend Thompson," she replied firmly, "you're describing the consequences of your crimes, not reasons to continue committing them. Those families received money stolen through insurance fraud. Those workers are slaves who deserve rescue, not abandonment. And this community deserves the truth about what's been done in the name of Christian charity." Her words hit with devastating precision. The moral high ground Thompson had long convinced himself he occupied crumbled under the weight of Rebecca's accusations. There was no more room for negotiation. The conversation had ended. The moment had arrived for Thompson to act. But Rebecca had made one final brilliant preparation. As she spoke her last words in Dr. Whitman's office, 2 Pennsylvania State Police investigators were already on a train to Millbrook, summoned by the evidence she had mailed to Harrisburg 3 days earlier. They would arrive that evening armed with warrants and accompanied by federal marshals who had been investigating reports of forced labor in the remote mining operations Thompson had been running. The confrontation in Dr. Whitman's office was interrupted by the unmistakable sound of horses and carriages arriving outside, a sign that marked the beginning of the largest criminal investigation in Pennsylvania's history and the end of Reverend Thompson's reign over St. Stephen's Church. What happened next would expose not only the scope of Thompson's conspiracy, but also the horrific conditions in the labor camps where his victims had been imprisoned. The network of corruption that had allowed such systematic evil to flourish under the protection of religious authority was about to be dismantled. This story centered around the horrific actions of Reverend Marcus Thompson and his associates is a powerful reminder of how deeply corruption can run, especially when cloaked in the guise of religion and charity. The investigation that followed Thompson's arrest in 1875 revealed the largest human trafficking operation in American history at that time. It's staggering to think of the scale of this conspiracy, where over 157 victims were documented and a network of forced labor camps spanned multiple states, all operating under the moral authority of religious ministry. The most unsettling part of the entire case is how many people were deceived, including the families who mourned their loved ones, never knowing they were manipulated into believing their family members had passed away. The immense emotional toll on these families is unimaginable. Additionally, the survivors, many of whom had been enslaved for years, lived through systematic psychological torture designed to break their will and prevent escape. It's heartbreaking to know that many had no idea they could ever return to their families without facing charges for crimes they didn't commit. Rebecca Morrison's role in this story is especially powerful. She not only uncovered the truth, but she used her newfound prominence to advocate for justice and victims' rights, ensuring that the evils of Thompson's scheme were exposed. Her courageous stance against the conspiracy ultimately saved countless future victims from suffering the same fate. This case raises some important questions. Can we trust institutions that have been granted authority, like religious groups and medical professionals, to protect us? Are there safeguards in place today to prevent the kind of systemic abuse that happened in Millbrook? While there are certainly more regulations now in place due to the aftermath of this case, the story serves as a chilling reminder that similar conspiracies could still operate in the shadows under the guise of good intentions. The power of ideological justification, as seen in Thompson's defense, is something that cannot be underestimated, and it continues to challenge the moral reasoning of many today. Rebecca's courage and the subsequent investigation led to significant reforms, but the psychological and societal scars left on Millbrook and its people would endure for generations. The ultimate realization is that community trust can be both a powerful shield and a dangerous weapon when wielded by those who seek to exploit it. Thompson's actions remind us that the greatest evils often thrive in plain sight, cloaked by the very systems that are meant to protect us. Now I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you believe that communities today are better protected against such systematic deception, or could similar conspiracies still thrive under the cover of religious or charitable authority? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this story compelling and want to explore more hidden chapters in American criminal history, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with others who care about uncovering the buried truths of our past. Remember, some of the most important stories are the ones that powerful people would rather we forget. Thank you everyone for watching the video. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel to watch the next interesting videos.